Welcome back to Murray's Minis and our final part of this classic Archaon diorama. This has taken me a lot longer than I was expecting it to, but to be honest, I kind of threw everything and the kitchen sink in terms of my various techniques at it, and a lot of things that I'd never tried before. There was a lot of experimentation to get a lot of this done, and to be honest, it was a bit draining. It took a lot more out of me than I was expecting. Overall, I'm actually kind of pleased with it. It turned out better than I was expecting. There are a few areas that could probably do with some touch-ups later on down the line. The one bit that I'm not all that enthralled with is the LED. I think that's more the positioning of where I put it, and it probably could have done with one or two more and maybe a bit of a spotlight on Archaon himself, considering he's kind of supposed to be the main figure of the diorama and he doesn't get any lighting. So the first thing I did with this was to cover up the LED with Hummerall and drop Archaon, of course, because if you're going to spray paint a model, you're going to want to drop it all over the place. I slapped down a Zenith will prime using grey and pure white primers, and then I used Skeleton Horde on the skeletons, believe it or not, shock horror. I love that sound. I used a mix of Plague Bearer, Guilliman Flesh on the wood to give a bit of tonal variety, and then a little bit of Wildwood all over the top to marry all of these tones together. I used Militarium Green. I slapped it down neat, which is a bit rare for me, followed by progressive wet blends of Basilicanum Grey. That way to give nice natural gradients between the greens and the greys, going from the surfaces of the mossy water and then moving up towards the rocky textures. I used watered down mixes of 4 different contrast colours: Guilliman Flesh, Ultramarines Blue, Basilicanum Grey, Sepia mixed with glazing medium, and that was how I created those rocky textury effects. After blocking out all of the metal colours and all of the contrast stages, this is the results that we are left with. And if you're not too fussy about your highlights, you could absolutely leave it here, but I'm a sucker for punishment, so I got out my wet palette. At this point, this wet palette had actually lasted me about 2 weeks. This is the same wet palette that I used for all of my highlights on my Nurgle Plague Engine. Feel free to check out that video, by the way. I am particularly proud of it, and it really hasn't done that well. So I went through various gradients of buff bone tones with the skeleton highlights. I really wanted the highlights on the skeletons to be really quite powerful and follow the tones that have already been laid down by the airbrushing and the contrast layers. These steps didn't actually take me that much time at all. Using a wet palette, which I would advise if you want to use lots of different tones with your highlights, wet blending them in on the wet palette and just going to town with all of these different tonal highlights, following the shades and the shadows, really gives a powerful effect to your models, and it really makes them look very realistic. So this is one way to do your rust tones. I just thin down 3 reddy brown rusty colours into a very thin glaze on my wet palette. So much so that it's like the consistency of semi-skimmed milk. I did the same with this mossy greeny effect on some of the wood, and I feathered it out with a bit of water from my cup. And this created a really lovely mossy green effect. I then went in with some gentle highlighting on the pier. I didn't want to go too OTT with this. Doing a similar process that I did with the skeletons, I then chose a variety of different grey and Payne's grey bluey type colours onto the rocky surfaces with lots of dotting, cross hatching and lots of scratchy textures painted on with my highlighting. And this makes all of those rocky textures come out and brings them out to life, and it looks so lovely. And as I said before, highlighting like this, it actually didn't take that long. I think I spent about half an hour doing all the highlights on the actual diorama base with the skeletons and the rocks. It's not that time consuming, and it's a really satisfying way of doing your highlights. To get out your wet palette, get a couple of different tones, 3-4 different tones, or even more, and just go to town with it. It's really fun. The highlights on all of the metallics for the skeletons was just really simple. It was just dots and dashes of Vallejo silver, and that was it. So I made myself a little bounding box for the resin. I used hot glue, and this was a process that was not refined. I was experimenting here, and it's gonna show in a minute. I did 2 pours in quick succession, which was a bit of a mistake because it created this oily, not very nice texture. It didn't particularly look 100% like water, but I used a little bit of Militarium green, mixed in the resin. This just looks really sploogey. It don't look right, does it? It's not right. If you like what you're seeing on the channel, please give this video a like or a comment. If there's something that maybe I haven't described well enough, just leave a comment asking, and I'm more than happy to get back to you guys. Or if you really want to support the channel, consider subscribing or supporting us on Patreon. It would mean the world. This is the point where disaster struck. All of the paper from the foam card had stuck onto the resin, and I had to try and cut off all of the hot glue with a knife and just try and take as much of this crap off as I could. I came up with a bit of a quick solution for the paper that was stuck on. I wet it down with some water and then used sandpaper, and this just made the paper that was stuck to the resin just turn into a pulp. The problem was that I was using sandpaper, not wet and dry paper, so the sandpaper was also turning to a pulpy consistency at the same time, but it got all of it off, which I'm really grateful for because that was just an absolute heartbreaking moment for me. It's finally time to be painting the main man himself. I blocked out all of the silver colours and then used Basilicanum Grey. Yet again, this is turning out to be one of my favourite paints for all of the areas that were going to be black. I used it neat, and also used Skeleton Horde, shock horror, yet again, on all of the bone areas, the skulls and the horns. And then used Blood Angels Red on the cape. Once again, neat, but we've done most of the groundwork with the Zenithal highlight, and this will set our guidelines of pretty much everything. It's one of the best ways to work. The sword, at this point, I've done completely wrong, so ignore this. I'd completely screwed it up. So here we're at the oil painting stage, which is usually one of my favourites, but as I said before, I was experimenting here and it's gonna show. I didn't really know what I was doing. I did all of the reds in the same way that I'd done the Imperial Fist Praetor before, but I decided to do blacks using oil paints, and this was something I've never done before. Painting black armour is something that I have always struggled with. In 20 years of being in this hobby, I have never managed to get decent looking black armour. But this time around I was actually really pleased with the results. This was definitely one of the highlights of this project, and it was relatively easy to do. It was just black oil paint into all of the deepest, darkest recesses, then adding progressive lighter tones of grey into the higher points of the armour and blending it in, and it works so well. I was actually kind of shocked at how well it worked. The one thing I would probably change about how I did this was that I over blended those tones. So when I went in with my acrylic highlights, it kind of dampened down the work I'd already done. You can see here that I'm actually quite harsh with my blending with my oil paints, and this is something that I've got to take stock of. If you would like to see a black armour painting video again, I'd quite like to do just a focus video on that, because using this technique and using oil paints, it's so much easier to get those nice grey blends, but that deep, rich, shiny, pure black in the recesses, and that's something that I just cannot do with acrylics. I've tried it over and over and over again, multiple different techniques, and my shaky hands just can't do the highlights that well, and it just never looks right. I've been working on this diorama over a week now, and I'm reaching the point where I'm feeling kind of burned out with it. There's been a lot of experimentation, with the blacks, with the resin, and a lot of things that I just didn't plan well enough. And I'm really resisting the temptation to just fob it off, stick it on the shelf, and look at doing another project. I decided to cast my mind back to when I first bought this miniature, which was about 2-3 years ago, and why I wanted it so much in the first place was because this came out in 2004 at a time when I couldn't really go to Games Day. I couldn't really go get this model. I've never been to a Games Day ever. I've never been to Warhammer World. I've never had that group where you can go and do that type of thing. And I really wanted to fill in on that community aspect and that feeling and feel like I was a part of that even though I wasn't. So it was a bit of wish fulfillment on my part, and I really wanted to do this thing well, but there were a couple of issues that I had to resolve with this before I could put this to bed and say I've done the best job I can with it. I decided to refocus my efforts and try to resolve the resin issue where I had to sand this down. It was just looking like a cloudy mess, and then I was kind of hit by the idea of, well, if it's resin, the only way I'm going to be able to fix this is with resin. So that's an old B&Q club card that I'd cut the end off to get a sharp line, and this is clear cast resin. I smoothed it over, and as you can see, it looks really good. You wouldn't know that I had to sand the living hell out of it to get all of the paper off. So I decided to take it one step at a time with this project to try and get it over the line and get it to a place where I'm not going to be completely happy with it because it's not perfect and I'm a perfectionist, and that's something that I'm trying to work on with my projects. Not everything has to be 100% perfect for me to get enjoyment out of it, but that's a personal flaw and it's something that I'm working on. And there were only a few things left for me to get this finished, and I needed to get this over the line because I hate having an unfinished project. I've got more than enough of those. So I'm back to a fresh wet palette, trying to blend it out. I took this model back onto the airbrush. I cut a tiny little slit out of a latex glove, slipped it over the model and re-airbrushed the sword so it would look right. Now, this effect is very rough and I'm not 100% happy with it, but it looks a damn sight better than it did. So I decided to compromise with this model. It's not going to be 100%. But it's going to look better than it did if I was just going to give up with it. To finish off the sword, I started by glazing darker colours onto the edges, onto the rims of it, to give the impression that the heat is within the centre of the sword. And I think this worked out okay. And then I was looking at it and thinking, oh, I can't just leave it at that. It doesn't look good enough. It doesn't look right. So I started to dot different colours in a colour progression, going from lighter at the bottom into darker to give that impression of like a magma dotting effect. When you look at lava, you've got the chunks of like dark rock that are floating to the very, very top of it. This would also help in that it would cover up some of my more spotty glazing work. So this is a little bit of a treat here, but at this point, this is what the end of this project was really about. It was about many cheats and hacks I could chuck at this thing to get it finished. And the end result looked okay. I wasn't horrified by it, and it looked quite nice. Although I think the bottom of the sword, where the very bottom meets the hilt of the blade, could probably do with a little bit of work, because it just doesn't seem to flow naturally. And that's probably going to nag at me, staring at me on the shelf for a very, very long time. So that's it guys. This is the final part. We're all done, and this project was so much more of a struggle than I was anticipating. I was expecting this to just flow easy like most of my recent videos, where I knew my processes, I knew what I was doing from experience, and I could just blad it out in a day or two. This project was not that. There was a lot of learning with this project. There were a lot of mistakes, a lot of foibles, and a lot of problems that I had to go in and resolve. But I feel like I've come out of it with a lot of solutions and a lot of new techniques that I can really plow through when I do another water effects tutorial, or when I try and paint eventually, when I get my hands on black Templars, try and actually do some decent black armor, which is something that has eluded me for like 20 years. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and if you really want to support us, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Thanks guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.